Who wants to throw the first
Who wants to
tomato?
I will throw a question. Has there been any discussion or analysis of the different motivations for movement? For example, moving from something or compared with moving to something.
Mhm.
And also the motivations we take for granted, mobility, freedom to move, for pleasure, just to see the world.
Yeah.
Comparing that with other reasons
Mhm.
for motivations.
Yeah, so there's two questions here, really. The first has to do with motivations. I think almost all of us do distinguish between those who are driven away from something, and we usually call them asylum seekers, refugees, exiles. There's a different terminology that we use, whereas the word immigrant usually means somebody drawn to. When, however, you do empirical research, either with the migrants today or the migrants of the past, and when you start focusing on individuals, you often find that it's not a dichotomy, one or the other. It's usually a combination of both, and that even those whom we see as most driven have usually exercised some choice in what they were drawn to, right? So that's my first point. We do make those distinctions, and usually the closer we look, the harder it is to maintain that these are two different categories of movers. They actually have a great deal in common, and they exercise varying degrees of choice. So that's the first question. The second question has to do with movement for pleasure. One of the most striking differences between our own mobile era and that of the 19th century is that poor people in the 19th century were more likely to move than richer people. And today, the tourists and the business travelers of the professional class, all those people that keep the business sections and first classes of transoceanic airlines full, are moving in much larger numbers than ordinary folks. But their moves are temporary, and that's why they're not restricted. Restrictions are on people who intend to change their home and loyalty, not on people who are traveling for pleasure. Much of the celebration of the freedom to movement in the last 15 years has been about tourists and business travelers. But everywhere you look in the world, it has become harder to move to a new country, to just take an ordinary job and to build a new life for yourself than it was in the 19th century. So I really encourage you to think about this perhaps unattainable goal of the freedom to move and choose your own home and allegiance. But you also, and I think we all need to think about what we lose when we simply reject that as impossible. Right? There's costs in both directions. I hope that's a satisfying answer. But I mean, there's billions. I mean, the UN used to try to keep track of the numbers of tourists and business travelers, and they at some point literally threw up their hands and said, we have to make do with estimates based on airline travel because there's so many. Whereas we can still count the people who have lived for more than a year outside the country of their birth, because every country in the world counts them and tracks them and makes them carry special papers that makes the counting easier. I mean, think of the piles of paper migrants have to carry. They didn't carry any papers in the 19th century. None, not even a passport. It was your right to move. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you've given any thought to the differences in this sense of how Americans identify themselves with inalienable rights and freedom versus the way Canadians, that's also a country full of immigrants who coerce their natives. But they don't have the same identification with inalienable rights. So where is it just because it's still a dominion of Great Britain? Mentally up there, they're not a dominion of Great Britain.
Right, I know. I mean, I've done a lot of thinking about Canada and the United States, largely during my study of Italian migrations around the world, since large numbers of Italians went to Canada as well as to the United States. I also have written a couple of books with my Canadian immigration colleagues. One of the things that always strikes me is, of course, there's a different political history. But it's particularly striking that what's different in the histories of the two countries is the absence of extensive institutionalized slavery in Canada. And there's something about that that makes the reception of the immigrant different in some kind of way. That's a very unsatisfying answer. But when I think about the differences between the two countries, that's the thing that stands out as being quite different in their political histories. Most of my Canadian colleagues who specialize in immigration history will say that Canada looks good as a nation of immigrants because it's not the United States and it doesn't have that long history of institutionalized racism. But they argue that, in fact, the border in Canada is just as difficult and troubling a place for a foreigner as the border of the United States is. And it's in the same way that it's easy for us to bash Thomas Jefferson, it's easy for Canadians to kind of look at the United States and say, oh, look at the disgusting things they do at their borders, right? My Canadian colleagues usually say, we're not doing so great at our borders either. But you are certainly right that the celebration of freedom through immigration it's just not there in the same way in the Canadian case. And that's not a satisfying answer, but it is something that I have thought about a little bit anyway. And I intend to think more about it. Thank you for that really good question.
May I just interject, what if one were to add another classic immigration country to that mix, say Australia?
Oh, I would actually...
US, Canada, Australia, three big...
Yeah.
Do you have a celebratory function, the celebratory dimension in Australia? Or is the celebratory dimension something uniquely American?
Well, there's a celebratory, there's a celebration of multiculturalism in Canada. That's absent in Australia, for example. Actually, the country that I like to add to the mix is Argentina.
Yeah.
Which is totally a nation of immigrants, quite similar to the United States. It's actually had much higher proportions of foreigners in the 19th century than either Canada or the US. And it prides itself, actually it's the country that prides itself on assimilation, much more like France does. Yeah, we let everybody in, but you know, then there are Argentines and it doesn't matter anymore where they came from. So there's different ways of celebrating the nation and of acknowledging the role of immigration in a nation's history, but no country in the world celebrates immigration as a symbol of freedom the way the United States does. And I am not a person who easily sees exceptionalism in US history, but I do think that is unique, and that's actually another book that I want to write someday, which is called Nations of Immigrants. Why is the United States the only country in the world that so celebrates its history of immigration as a symbol of its kind of political superiority and special freedoms? And I think you had a hand.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, well, I mean, you can look at the last presidential debates for Nation of Immigrant talk again. I was just... I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the idea of the frontier. I was trying to think of some idea that best represented to me, like the freedom to move, and I was thinking about frontier, but that was also an idea that was so important in that period in which you were kind of describing as being
the period of
increasing
enthusiasm.
Right?
Yeah, and ambivalence. But what really strikes me about the so-called frontier period is that the exact same word was used for people from New England and for foreigners who went west. And they were not called immigrants, they were called emigrants. They were going out from civilization to bring civilization to the frontier. And that, that's the moment in US history where you didn't really even need a different word for the native, the American, and the foreigner who is on the move west. The same word is used for both. The immigrant, by contrast, that's literally a term that's used first for the Chinese on the West Coast, and then for Italians and the Irish beginning already in the 1820s and 1830s. If they settle on the East, they're called immigrants, not emigrants. And that's where we begin to see this ambivalence and the beginnings of the movement to restrict. We want emigrants. We don't really want immigrants.
Well, I was thinking in terms of, besides just the immigrants, you also have that expansion of slavery becomes such a central question
Yeah.
to, you know, all
Yeah.
the
I mean,
afterwards.
for me, the most fascinating and the most puzzling part of this history is why the move to end coercion and restrictions on the freedom of American Indian and African Americans, why the ending of that accompanies literally the growing restrictions that we place on the border. It may be there's no relationship whatsoever, and it's just one of those fascinating correlations like breast cancer and steel production. But my gut sense as an historian is there's a relationship there, and I'm trying to puzzle out what the methodology would be that would allow me to explore it, because I think it's a very important issue. And one that we don't really get at if we celebrate the Nation of Immigrants, because the Nation of Immigrants as a celebration doesn't allow us to talk about the restraints and the absence of freedoms, even though that's part of the history. Yes?
I just wonder if you comment on the changing nature of immigration. If you take Swedish immigration, for instance, as a fairly recent immigrant from Sweden myself, that's still possible, but you have now to bring to the table educational qualification or financial capability. But then it's still, I mean, still possible, immigration still takes place.
It is not easy, simple, or fast for almost anyone from any country in the world to immigrate to the United States, unless you have a citizen father, husband, wife, or, it'll take longer, a green card, husband, father, wife. It's easiest for people who are relatives. If you are not the relative of a U.S. citizen or a holder of a U.S. green card, if you only have the desire, you will have to sort of bring something to the table, as you see. And that is true for Swedes, that is true for Canadians. 1/3 of U.S. visas are for refugees and people with economic qualifications. And within that 1/3, almost all of the visas for those looking for work are for those who are highly specialized, highly creative, or have $10,000 to invest in a U.S. small business. There are 5,000 to 10,000 visas available for blue-collar workers to enter the United States every year. And if you want to understand why we have 10 million people living in this country today without documentation, that's why. There is no line to wait on. I don't think, actually, that the United States is substantially different in this regard than most other nations. It is absolutely the case that Europeans have gained greater mobility with the formation of the European Union. But at the same time that the borders went down for Europeans moving about within Europe, Europe strengthened its borders and became what's called Fortress Europe. The world is full of nation states that are fortresses, which treat everything within their borders as a kind of private property on which no trespassing is allowed. And that's why I ended with pictures of do not enter, no trespassing, walls, fingerprinting, biometrics. We do not live in a world that allows people, easily at least, to change their home or to choose their own rulers. And those were two fundamental principles, at least in the abstract, of what freedom meant in the 18th and 19th century. We're not there anymore. We don't celebrate those. We don't even seek those anymore. Yes, sir?
Can you comment on the relative ability of people to move within the United States or within Canada in the 18th and 19th centuries versus their ability to move around within a country like Sweden or Italy in the 18th and 19th centuries, their ability to move from country to country?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that the United States signed those trade treaties was because many European countries in the early 19th century prohibited people from leaving, right? And there were lots of barriers to internal movement. In Germany, for example. Sweden, for example. So there was a political struggle, literally, to gain those freedoms, historically. And even today, not all countries feel moved by the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Cuba, until very recently, had an exit visa. You had to get permission to leave. And the Soviet Union, for most of its history, had barriers to internal movement. But worldwide, increasingly, I think, I haven't made a systematic study of all 202 nation states around the world, but barriers to internal movement have generally diminished, especially in the last 50 years or so. But that has not been accompanied by the lowering of boundaries around the nation state. And again, I don't know if there's a necessary or even just a sufficient relationship between those two, but the broad pattern of diminishing barriers within and rising barriers at the border is pretty striking. Think about it. Think about why that is, and think about what that serves, what work that does, what that helps us, or you, or me, or anyone to achieve. If somebody like Thomas Jefferson were alive today, he would probably say, of course the world wants to move here to enjoy our wonderful form of government. Can you be a country that argues for a social contract where people choose their representatives if you don't allow people to choose to be governed by that political system? To Jefferson and to many Americans in the early 19th century, the most satisfying indicator of the superiority and the desirability and the wonder, literally, of American democracy was that so many people chose it as a form of government by migrating to the United States. We've lost that.
Yes, final question.
I'm a little curious why the Chinese were singled out. Today we might think of them as so many, well, as a billion, and so that the population pressure seems kind of imposing. They're obviously identifiably foreign, and then visually foreign, and then just a foreign culture. And then lastly, I was going to interject the notion is that a few foreigners are interesting. When there's a critical mass, they seem to be invasive, a little like plant species.
Okay, so a couple of things.
What would have been the argument for the Chinese at that point? I can't imagine that worldwide that they were that big a nation.
Oh, China was still a very large nation in the 19th century. It was, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but it's probably 4 or 5 times the size, the population of the United States. The fear of the Chinese, most of us would say today, was largely a racial one, although usually what people said is they're barbarians, they're not really free people, they come as coolies, they undermine our freedom by coming here. et cetera, et cetera. But almost all of the new literature on the Chinese as the first immigrant group to be restricted focuses on racial designators that just say these people are not acceptable, they will never become Americans. And the Congress literally says, listen, the Constitution gives Congress the right to decide who can naturalize. You shouldn't be negotiating that in a treaty. The larger question that you're answering has to do with population pressures. And lots of people say to me, because I do sometimes just say, maybe it would just be better if we just let people move around where they want to move. You know, okay, let's just make a radical demand for open borders. And the usual response that I get to that is, everybody would move here. Right? There's so many people out there and they all want to come to the United States. Well, first of all, they don't all want to come to the United States. We know for a fact that only 15% of populations worldwide, and this was a pretty good study that was done actually, random sample, all of that. Only 15% want to leave their country. And I know, as a matter of fact, that not all of them want to come here. And here, as an historian, I can also tell you, you know, there was a time when we had open borders. And there was never a time during that period when all of the people of any country, Sweden, Norway, Italy, Mexico, Canada, they never all moved here. It may be true that migrating is normal and not catastrophic or unusual, but it's never the case that everybody wants to move. Midwesterners kind of like to stay put, and so do Italians, Norwegians, and Swedes. The highest percentage of a country leaving is usually about 15%. In fact, that's the percentage of Italians who had left in the 19th century. That's about the percentage of Mexicans living outside of Mexico today. It's around 12 or 15%. So I don't really fear that population inundation. And I don't find environmentalist and population-driven arguments for greater restrictions particularly compelling. But that's largely because I don't think that nation states are private property, and I don't think that we own the property of the United States. I don't think we're the equivalent. I, as a citizen, don't feel that I'm the equivalent of the individual who's put up that no trespassing sign there. But that's a statement about whether rights are created by nations or whether or not they're inalienable, created by God or by nature.
I like what you're saying. I agree that there has to be this correlation between lowering the restriction within the United States and increasing that restriction for people wanting to come. I think there is a correlation there. Do you have any sort of theories as to why that is? I mean, is it a cultural standard that maybe could evolve into something completely different in 100 years from now? Or,
Well, I'm an historian and I do teach world history, so often I teach the slime to outer space in 17 weeks or something like this. So I know that things can change actually relatively rapidly over time, if you think relatively rapidly means 100 years or 200 years or 500 years.
I actually majored in history, so
I'm sorry?
I actually majored in history, so
Oh, okay. So yeah, actually, yes, I think things can change. I don't actually see at the moment, either in the United States or almost any other country in the world, mobilization around the issue of the freedom to move. There are a few kind of identifiable groups of people in the world who argue strongly for the freedom to move. Some of them are big businessmen, right? Who say every mobile person generates more capital and results in more perfect competition and we all benefit. Read The Economist, right? And that kind of 19th century liberal thinking is completely consistent, and The Economist says freedom of movement is the only way to go because it's economically efficient. You also find libertarians who argue that it's your body, you should be able to move it wherever you want in pursuit of happiness. And the other group, rather usually separate from the libertarians, although there's a little bit of overlap, are anarchists. who just say nation states suck anyway. Why should they be telling us where we can go? It's not their private property, right? So there's three groups that actually do argue for greater freedom to move in today's world. The likelihood of the three of those groups getting together and forming a political movement to argue for the inalienable rights of man to change his or her home and allegiance, I don't see it happening. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.